Thank you very much for inviting me to give this webinar today. And just very briefly, I have been, as a professor and researcher in biology, studying the song system of several birds, but mostly of the nightingale, for more than 20 years in Berlin at Free University, but also at other universities in Germany. Meanwhile, I have left academics, but I'm still into science. And yeah, maybe during the course of the talk, you will hear a bit about my new perspectives on the nightingales and its song. Let me start by talking a bit about the nightingale. And I would like to mention here that that is kind of the European perspective. Seen from here, the nightingale is a very common songbird. And the males of the species establish territories in shrubs and parks and in the greens and the countryside, but also quite in dense cities after they have arrived from migration. Only the males are singing in the nightingale, and they do so at day and most prominently also at night. And males often interact with each other and also with our playbacks, allowing us to ask all kinds of research questions. And the song learning of the species is very well investigated, mostly by the group of Henrike Hulsch and Dietmar Todt, who spent years after years to train birds and to inquire into their song learning system. This was mostly done in the lab. Nothing so far has been known until a couple of years ago about the things that go on in the real environment of the birds in nature in terms of song learning and song changes. And to get started with, I would like to play to you a brief part of nightingale singing. What we have here is actually two birds, two males that engage in counter singing. So we have one bird starting and then the next joining in, and I will aim to follow what we are hearing here with my cursor. So let's listen. So this might go on for hours and hours in a soft spring night. This song type matching is particularly amazing if we keep in mind that each bird possesses about roughly 180 different song types. So picking the exact fitting match is barely possible by chance for these birds. And with that, before I go into any of our studies and results, I would like to just give you a very brief 101 of nightingale songs. So as I just mentioned, these birds have extremely large repertoires, I would say extraordinarily large, with roughly 180 different song types per male. We have 1-year-old birds that sing only 60 or 80 different song types, and we have sometimes males that sing up to 250 different song types. And all these songs have to be acquired or learned in the beginning of the bird's life during the first weeks of their lives. Here we see 3 songs, and after each song, as you can see, we have a pause or a break, and then the next thing is following song, and then the next song. And as you can also see, they switch to a new song type after each song, so they mostly don't immediately repeat what they have been singing, and they sing in these long song sequences of hours and hours. At the same time, in their learning and singing, they are very precise and stereotype. And so despite having all these different songs, if we compare, for example, the song of the male in 2 successive years, we find the exact same pattern. And if we compare the song between males, then we also find the exactly same song type. And even if I do this over long time spans and very far geographic distances, it turns out that the song types themselves are really not changing at all. So let's listen to these 3 songs. Now we have the break. Okay, and the last one was one of these famous whistle songs that apparently are doing something to many listeners' ears and hearts that are part of, I think, the romantic connotation of the Song of the Nightingale. So when I was a professor at the Freie University Berlin, we were running long-time studies on nightingale populations in Berlin and Brandenburg. And what we did is collecting as much information about the birds as possible. And first of all, these were, of course, song recordings during the night and during the day, but we also documented the territories of birds, their age. We took all kinds of body measures and about their condition. For some studies, we even took the hormonal status of the birds. We inquired into their immune system and parasite load, and into, of course, their mating and breeding success. We investigated parental investment, so how much these males contributed to feeding the young, and we did paternity analysis. With this large data set, we were able to inquire into questions about what the singing of the nightingale is all about. So what are these males communicating when they engage in these long song bouts? What I would like to keep you in mind here for the first time is that when I talk of all these measures, we are talking of a rather short time span that is after the arrival of birds at their breeding grounds, which is roughly during mid-April and end April. And then they are obligatory only breeding once per year. So even if they fail, they do not start a second brood. And then the youngs are hatching and they stick together for some more weeks. They are going through their first molt. And then in late August, they are leaving their breeding grounds again. So this, I guess everybody who's working on seasonal species knows this, keeps you extremely busy during this part of the year. But also maybe is leaving a bit of a blind spot towards the other times when simply the birds are not around. I will get back to this in a moment. So, but let's stick with the breeding time and our measures for a moment. So that is basically what it looks like when you take measures from a bird. We captured them in mist nets and then took all kinds of measures and probes. And after only a couple of minutes, we let the bird fly off again. And since we used colorings and since we were pretty much aware of where birds are situated, where the territories are, we were able then to relate song and characteristics of the male. And this is actually, as I mentioned before, what we were interested in. So on the one hand, we have all these song measures that we determined. And on the other hand, we have all kinds of individual traits or characteristics that we have about this male. And we were interested in this question on whether, or let's say, if we assume that females base their male preferences on song characteristics and male adjust their agonistic interactions on the base of song characteristics, then somehow, one way or another, this song must be a reliable indicator of these individual traits. And at the same time, we were always interested also to look at the female perspective and see whether the female is actually using this information in her mating decisions, which is kind of the least studied part, not only for nightingales, but for many, many other species as well. And so in several studies, we were able to show that, for example, song or certain song measures differ with age. We could also show that and how the species signature is included in singing, and that was done by studying the nightingale and its twin species, the thrush nightingale, in an area where both species occur or reoccur together. And there we have mixed singers and we have true hybrids, and of course this is mediated by song. And just one more thing I would like to point out here is that in one study we were able to show that when we look at the parental contribution of males to feeding the young at the nest, it turned out that certain song measures in the beginning of the breeding season were quite reliable predictors of this later parental contribution. So if a female would listen the same way we did in our analysis, then she might have heard already about how good as a provider the male would be. I could talk about this for hours, but I will not today, and instead I can only hint at several studies on this topic. And instead I would like to go back on this, European seasons. So at the moment I'm here sitting in fall, it's getting colder day by day. No, none of the nightingales I've been investigating is ever experiences this part of the year, because they are, of course, not here in winter. They are an obligatory long-distance migratory species. And they spend their non-breeding in sub-Saharan Africa. And when I started studying nightingales for several years, it was always the same, that when people who had been traveling to Africa or having been working there or having done research on other species, I was always asking, so what about nightingales? Did you hear any? And then I had this one text that said, oh, there was an alley of trees filled with nightingales, all singing. And then I was inquiring again, and other people told me, never, ever have I ever heard any nightingale in Africa, in the areas where we expecting them to be. So they were somehow every and nowhere, and nobody really knew where. And this situation only improved from 2013 on, so like 10 years ago, when Steffen Hahn and colleagues from the Vogelwarte in Sembach started to study migratory routes, first of all, by using stable isotopes, where you can get a good, so very rough idea on where a tissue that is under investigation, so you can use a claw or also a feather tip, where this tissue has been formed. And it turned out that 3 populations that are very geographically distinct in Europe in the breeding are staying during winter time also at very distinct areas. So that was the first study suggesting that birds that spend their summer in one area are also spending their winter in similar areas, not their winter, but their non-breeding, I should say. And just a year later, we had a second study coming out by the same colleagues, and this time they used data logger, which allowed for a much more detailed determination of areas where the birds rest during migration and then where they spend their non-breeding. I today would like to talk about a study that I did together, where it was not so much about the location, because thanks to Clive Barlow, who is a really very motivated and very successful ornithologist from the Gambia, we had an idea already on where in the Gambia nightingales were staying and sitting and actually also singing, because Clive Barlow did a lot of recordings and they even did some ringing of birds in the Gambia. That is a typical habitat where the nightingale is spending their non-breeding. And what we did in a first study that has been published like 6 years ago, we compared the recordings of nightingales during breeding and during non-breeding. And we were interested to figure out how the song in winter is actually sounding, and whether we can see in nature what we knew from the lab, that the song system is basically fully breaking down during non-breeding, and the bird starts to re-establish their song year after year. If you want to imagine, it's a little bit as if we would lose our speech in each year and then rebuild it like a toddler is doing it year after year again and again. So that is how it looked like under laboratory conditions, and we were really interested in how this would look like in the field. So what we did, I took all these recordings that Clive Barlow had taken from the Gambia, and also recordings from breeding in Berlin-Brandenburg population, and I compared each song that was on the recording to a catalog of nightingale songs that we had established for several other studies. And we had all these measures of like full catalog song, where you can probably see here in this example that all the different elements are very same to that one in the catalog. Remember, I told you they sing very stereotyped and precise. But sometimes we had also a song where only a part was in the catalog and then something different was added or several elements were missing. Of course, we had clear definitions for that. We had parts of the song where we had only identified elements, but no really like songs. And then also we had something that I would call unidentified patterns. And I was talking to several people who are not trained as bioacousticians, but are very good in recognizing nightingale song. And they told me, well, if I would hear that, I would never ever have the idea that that is actually a nightingale singing. Yeah, because mostly people here did not hear that kind of song. So, and to summarize the results of the study, we did have some birds that were indeed showing a complete breakdown of their song systems, and that were mostly throughout the recording singing kinds of this. And then we had also birds that were, that were at the different side of the spectrum, that were singing something that we would call full song, that were really using their song types very similar to how they performed it in summer. If you took a closer look, you could see that the precision with which the elements are formed is a little bit lower during non-breeding, and but still it is fully recognizable nightingale song. And for our study, we had not yet an idea what the function of singing during winter might be. My two preferred hypotheses were either that song is functional during winter, that they are territorial, for example, and use their song to communicate, or alternatively, that during non-breeding, these areas where the birds stay together but do not breed, that they use this time, if you want so, as a marketplace to exchange about which song types to sing next in the next year. Because we see that from year to year during breeding, birds use different song types differently often. So we have kind of a fashion of the year. And one idea might be, and is still not ruled out, that this is negotiated during their times in non-breeding. And just in this year came out a study by Henrik Brumm and his colleagues, who was investigating the singing of the thrush nightingale in winter, and they did indeed turn out that males that possess full song during non-breeding also are territorial towards other males. So there might be more than just having this marketplace of fashionable song, several song types, but also that they indeed use it. And it's most probable that all this is related to levels of hormones, mostly of testosterone, that is regulating song, and at the same time territoriality in this bird. So this is the stage that we are at the moment in terms of understanding what birds are doing during winter and how they sing during winter. And I think it leaves us with many, many open questions, what's going on through this part of the year. So if we look again at this like annual cycle as typical for Central Europe, and we look at the year of the nightingale down here, then we see that for the nightingale, breeding is not the longest part of the year. It's actually having only roughly more than a third of the annual time cycle the nightingale has, and most of the time is spent during off-breeding. And here you can see the both aligned together. So at this part of the year, males should arrive on their off-breeding grounds. And as I just said, maybe some are territorial, maybe some are going through the song reorganization and are non-territorial. Then we have spring migration starting in mid-March, and then they arrive, as I said, at their breeding sites roughly in mid to end April. And I guess almost anybody who's giving a talk in this webinar might at some point have to point out that, of course, we are facing changes here. And again, I would like to mention a study authored, amongst others, by Clive Barlow, who not only collected song samples, but also collected data of arrival and departure of birds from their off-breeding, not only nightingales, but many, many different song type species. And it turned out that, most probably due to global warming, that we have a change, and that is actually a considerable change, not only of 1 or 2 days, but many, many days. The pre-breeding migration starts earlier, so the birds are leaving earlier for their breeding grounds, and the post-breeding migration starts later. So far, nobody is able to say whether this is mostly due to changes on the breeding ground or changes during off-breeding. What we can say is that life history cycles of these long-distance migratory species is severely affected and definitely changing due to changes in global climate. And with this, and for the very last minutes of the talk, I would like to switch gears and topics. And as I told you before, I'm not longer in academics, and now working in my new profession as a teacher, I finally ended up having the time to do one of the most fun things that I ever did about nightingales, and that is collecting all this like anecdotes and all the stories, and also some, of course, of my research experiences, and write a book about the nightingale, and which is unfortunately only available in German. But here I would just like to show you that I was teamed up for this text with an illustrator, Niels Hoff, and he read the book, and then he came up with his own ideas about how Nightingale's life might be illustrated using this like hybrid figure. So here, this is his idea of how paternal contribution in a nightingale might look like. And this is a favorite for the school kids. This is what you heard in the beginning, the interaction of nightingales. This is a rap battle with nightingales being engaged. And at the same time, for this book, I was able to collect all these like stories and make the point that the nightingale is having this like really, really important position in cultural history of all kinds. So not only in music, but also in many poems, in many books. And here are not only like the German all-time favorites like Goethe, but also, of course, if you think of Keats and his song for the nightingale, Oscar Wilde and his famous fairy tale about the nightingale and the rose. And also, I'm talking about the history of how bird studies were done before recordings were possible. And here I've just copied, and I promise I will only do very few lines, but before recordings, people aimed to put what the nightingale is singing into human sound, and it might then sound like tiu 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 tiu, spitze quad, tiu 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 dix, quadio 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 quadio, swok 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 swok, chu 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 chu. Okay, I'm stopping here. It's more fun with a real audience, I can tell you. Anyway, I guess every nightingale in the world would agree, and everybody of you would agree, this does barely ever sound like anything nightingalish, but it was very serious. It was really the aim of putting into letters what the nightingale is actually singing. And with this, I'd like to finish. And as a summary, I would like to point out that the nightingale is a long-distance migrant with complex life histories at very different places and in very different habitats, as we heard. Nightingales are extremely successful organizers. That is, despite noise and light pollution, despite habitat fragmentation and human presence, they are really successful in breeding in cities, in city parks mostly. And as I gave you an idea in the end, it is a species with a very good and renowned reputation and a prominent role in cultural history. And thus, and this is a plea to everybody of you who is still looking for a research model species, I think it's a study that is, it's a species that is extremely well suited to study behavioral adaptation in the Anthropocene in all different parts. Thank you so much. Oh no, I shouldn't say thank you without acknowledging so many people that assisted in all these studies that we did throughout the years. For today, I would like once more mention the collaboration with Clive Barlow, who really collected these data, sometimes without even knowing who will at one point make something out of it. And now it's really, really helpful to have these data and to look at them. And several other collaborators also contributed. Thank you so much.